Today we're going to have a bit of a discussion as to how much a command point is really worth, and hopefully it might help you zero in on the stratagems that you really want to be using in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures and our command points on the battlefield. Now, the vast majority of people will find command points fairly intuitive to use after having played enough games with them, and to know when they're going to have more value spending the command points on a stratagem, or whether it's best to hold off and save them for a better opportunity later. In this video we're going to talk a bit about the value of command points, where it comes from, and how to get the most out of this valuable resource. So let's jump right into it. Okay, let's start by saying that command points are not a free resource. Particularly among newer players, they see them as basically free actions that you can take and only ever a positive thing. This isn't really the case. Command points do have to be paid for, and mainly at an army construction level. Basically HQs and troops are the main things that generate command points these days, as battalion detachments for 5 command points are typically the way that most CP gets into lists these days. For the most part, HQs and troops aren't generally the biggest sources of killing power or survivability compared with their elite and heavy support counterparts. Many lists out there would love to just load up on loads of killy elite and heavy support big guns and not bother with troops at all. But a lot of them are tempted to include troops because the HQ and troops are the things that get you command points, and command points are very powerful. You can sort of think as command points being a bonus that you get for including the HQ and troops choice in the army, and the benefit of the command points is tied to the points cost that you pay for the HQs and troops. To make it efficient, you want to be fielding the minimum amount of HQs and troops in each battalion, as you'll get the biggest command point reward for fielding those minimum sized battalions, which is why we often see in competitive lists a lot of battalions running around with just the stock 2 HQ choices and 3 troops, such as the Astra Militarum Loyal 32, that became a massive staple on the competitive scene for a very long time. One of the reasons that these guys were so good was that they were fairly functional in themselves as reasonably durable mobile units that are useful to have around, and also get you a whole load of command points on top of that. So you kind of got a double benefit, the utility of the units for the points that you paid, and also all the 5 command points that you get on top of that. There are of course other ways to get command points, things like warlord traits and relics, where the main price that you pay is the opportunity cost of not having something else. So you are sacrificing other powerful in-game abilities to be able to get more command points through command point farming via the Grand Strategist Warlord trait for Astra Militarum, for example. Conversely, some units that people include in their armies actually need command points to function to any real level of success. One good example of this could be Genestealer Cult Aberrants. They're very killy if you can get them into close combat, but basically you are going to need to spend command points to get them there, at least with some degree of reliability. You can almost think of by including that unit in your list, you're basically already detracting yourself command points even before the game started, because you know you're going to have to use those to make that unit even work and not be a complete dead weight on the table. This is a negative to fielding this sort of unit, though obviously your reward is the ludicrous killing power that some of these options can have when on the table. There are a few ways that we could think about attributing a value to the humble command point. Firstly, you could think about how much you'd willingly spend a command point for in terms of killing certain enemy units. This is usually quite easy to work out for certain stratagems. Say some stratagems do mortal wounds to enemy units. If you do D3 mortal wounds to an enemy unit, then that's an average of 2 mortal wounds, which you could easily calculate as what is the cost of the 2 models that you're killing, and is that enough to justify using the stratagem. For example, if it's 2 guardsmen, then it's often not going to be worth it, but perhaps if it's 2 Eldar Dark Reapers, then maybe it is. This is a pretty decent rule of thumb, but it does fall down in some ways. Basically, once you're actually on the field of battle, the points that you paid for the models don't actually matter. All that matters is the value that those models are actually bringing to the table. For example, those 2 Dark Reapers might not actually be a big deal if you're playing an army that's entirely Orc boys, whereas it could be vital to kill those 2 guardsmen if they happen to be actually on an objective and the only way that you could kill them was with a stratagem. So the value of the models that you've paid for changes greatly depending on who you're playing, where those models are positioned on the board, if it's somewhere valuable or if it's somewhere redundant, or perhaps if they're in a position to take out some of your key units next turn. You could also do the same calculation for defensive type stratagems, such as the Space Marine Duty Eternal stratagem for Dreadnoughts, which make them a lot tougher. Usually that's a very good value stratagem. By reducing incoming damage on a fairly expensive model, you're likely to save a lot of valuable wounds of Dreadnought from turning into scrap. so thinking about the points cost of the models killed is helpful, but you do need to weight that as to whether or not it's actually important to kill those models to win you the game or not. Another way to ascribe a value to a command point might be how much would you pay for a command point if the only way to get them was to pay a certain amount of points in place of taking some models in your army. Say if every army list just had to take the models that they could take, and then could choose to buy in command points for say 10 points apiece or something like that. You could see that the amount that you willingly pay for a command point as being representative of their value in game if we are using points as a balancing mechanism. I think if you do this sort of thought experiment, then it becomes apparent that each command point after the first that you buy becomes progressively less and less valuable. I think most armies would pay quite a lot of points to get the first few command points in their army, as they could target those command points to the absolute most valuable stratagems that they have. Once you get into dozens of the things though, they'd become less and less valuable to you, as you're already going to be able to play your core stratagems, and the rest might just be nice to haves but non-essentials. There are a few factors that are going to affect how much a command point is worth to you when you're actually in a game and you're committed to a list. If you're playing an army that has very few command points available, then the value of each one of those is very high indeed. For example, when I was playing my recent Iron Hands list with a whole load of very shooty and very dangerous vehicles, but no troops at all, I only had 3 command points. This just meant that I just didn't bother with any stratagems that weren't absolutely crazy good in terms of value. I just tended to save them to use Duty Eternal on the Leviathan Dreadnought I was running, as that's an enormously valuable stratagem, as for 1 command point you get an enormous damage reduction on one very powerful model. If you only have a few command points, then you're going to be saving them for the very best circumstances. You're generally just not going to use them on command rerolls to get you a little bit of extra damage on turn 1, because frankly that would be a waste, and there's likely to be more valuable times to use them later in the game. Another factor that affects the value of command points to you is just how powerful your faction's stratagems are. In particular, Imperial Guard is a faction that, at least until the supplement books that they've been given, struggle to turn their command points into effective damage output. Aside from Vengeance Vicadia, which is amazing, the vast majority of their stratagems were just a little bit underwhelming, providing mediocre buffs to the Guard's fairly cheap units. So again, the value of a command point to a Guard player might be fairly low, and it might be driven even lower because the fact that they can get quite so many command points in a list very cheaply with their good infantry squads and cheap HQs meant that they often had the command points to spare. And back at the start of 8th edition when I was playing Foot Guard, I was using command points at pretty much every opportunity with command rerolls all over the place, as when you have a lot and your stratagems aren't that great, the value of each command point is pretty low, so you may as well get through them quite quickly. Talking of getting through them quickly, another thing that influences a command point's value is how soon you use it. Generally speaking, in a game of 40k, you generally want to be inflicting damage or saving damage on your army as early as possible. This is because, say if your stratagem kills an enemy unit turn 1 out of a 6-turn game, then that unit won't be functioning and killing your units for the next 5 turns. On the other hand, if you use a stratagem, say turn 4 and kill that same unit, it's already had 4 turns worth of killing your army, so your opponent's probably got quite a lot of value out of it already. This is why you see quite a lot of players absolutely burn through their command points turn 1 and turn 2, trying to break the back of the enemy army and put them firmly on the defensive by turn 3. If you had an otherwise even conflict, where one player spent all of their command points turn 1 to try and get as much damage output as they possibly could straight away, then they might put the other player in a spot where it doesn't matter how many command points they spend in turn 3, they don't have enough army to deal the damage and to use all of those buffs efficiently. So in general, command points are more valuable turn 1 and become less and less valuable as the game goes on. So you sort of have to balance using the command points on the absolute best things that you can with using them as early as possible. So I hope that some of that has somewhat helped people appreciate where the value of command points comes from and how to get the best bang for your buck out of the stratagems in an actual game of 40k. As to my answer for how much a command point is actually worth, a general rule of thumb that I tend to use myself, which I admit is very simplistic, but if it's a stratagem that's likely to kill something like 20 to 30 points of enemy models, or save 20 or 30 points of my own per 1 command point, then I usually think that it's a reasonably good deal, obviously bearing in mind all the factors that we talked about above, including whether it's actually going to help win the game, how many command points we have available, and also how early in the game it is. Obviously, it's not really worth calculating the individual points cost for every stratagem used, but it really can help you think about whether or not a stratagem is actually going to be worth it or not, and can really highlight the stratagems that are incredibly good value. A few ones that are obviously great value with this particular rule of thumb are things like re-rolling a charge roll, as if your unit gets into close combat and does some horrendous damage to an enemy unit, then it's easily possible that you could potentially kill 100 points of models via the use of one command point, so charge rolls are in general a very good use of a command point. Another particularly powerful stratagem is any stratagem that allows your models to fight again in close combat. Again, basically getting an entire extra fight phase could easily both kill a lot of enemy models and even potentially save your models that are in close combat from getting killed by the models that they killed next turn. So that Space Marine Honour the Chapter stratagem to fight again in the fight phase can easily be worth the 3 command points. Conversely, it can help you show that some stratagems just aren't really worth the hassle and are basically traps. For example, there's a new stratagem in the Guard Greater Good book. It gives you +1 to hit and wound for a heavy weapon team. I was initially thinking that this might be quite good when used on missile launchers, but actually having done the maths, it only really equates to an extra wound or 2 at the very most against most enemy armoured targets. Occasionally that might be worth it, but it's really on the borderline of whether or not you'd ever want to bother with it. The command point reroll is also one that can sometimes be a trap, giving you far less value than you might think just from guesswork. Particularly rerolling hits is not very valuable at all, as you don't know whether they're going to wound. Rerolling wounds isn't always amazing, as you don't know what the damage would be. So generally it's usually best just to reroll damage on command rerolls as opposed to the hit and wound roll, at least for the most part. Rerolling a damage roll of 1 on a command point reroll will average you an extra 2.5 wounds, so will often be a bit more of a reasonable return on investment, depending on exactly what you're shooting at. Anyway, I hope that slight ramble has been somewhat useful as to the value and spending of command points. If you have any other thoughts or things that I've missed as to the acquisition and spending of command points, please let me know down in the comments. I'll certainly be looking forward to reading any ideas. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We've got 40k tactics content coming out every single day. If you'd like to support the channel and you happen to live in the UK, I do have an Element Games affiliate link down in the description below. Basically, if you're thinking about buying some Warhammer in the near future and you'd like to support the channel, if you give that link a click before making an order, a bit of the profits goes towards Auspex Tactics without costing you any more. Element is a decent discount retailer. I've used myself plenty of times before, and I've never had any problems with any of my orders from them, so can fully recommend. In any case, thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.